For those who may be new to this history, can you briefly explain why Japanese Americans were forcibly removed and incarcerated during World War II and what the country later acknowledged about those decisions that were made?
Right. Well, so in George Takei's graphic memoir, it sort of starts right in 1941, right, with Pearl Harbor, and then early 1942 with the actions that are taken right after. And while it's true that Pearl Harbor, had a profound impact on the Japanese American community, I think that sort of taking a step back, it's really important to show that, this was this long trajectory of discrimination and prejudice towards immigrants, towards Japanese Americans specifically. And it wasn't just Pearl Harbor that caused the mass removal and incarceration, that it's part of this longer history of discrimination and prejudice and racism and wartime hysteria and a failure of political leadership. And those are the reasons for the incarceration that came out many years later, when this was being sort of examined to understand why the mass removal and incarceration happened. But I think at the time, in 41, 42, like there was just a lot of wartime hysteria and again, the prejudice and racism that led to these actions. Even though the United States was at war with Japan, they were also at war with Germany and Italy too. And those immigrant populations that were here in the United States weren't impacted in the same way, or as profoundly as Japanese Americans. So it shows that there was a difference there in how Japanese Americans were treated in comparison to these other communities.
Yeah, indeed. One of the things that I feel like really gave me a warm, fuzzy feeling, but also like a sense of security and relatability, that it's okay to talk to children about the things that are happening in the world around them at a level in which they're able to understand. But by doing so, it helps to build confidence in those children. And I think one of the most powerful elements of the book is when George Takei's father exhibits dignity and he expresses honesty to his children and his profound belief in democracy, even after all of the injustice that his family experienced. And so, in your work, how often do you see stories of leadership and resilience that emerge from families who experienced incarceration?
Yeah, I mean, this is such a great question because I think that this book examines this in so many different ways. So one, I do think that, while during World War II, while George and his siblings were children, maybe his parents, didn't talk to them so directly. They, did try to shield them a little bit from what was happening around them. But, throughout the graphic memoir, George kind of in these flashbacks talks about these discussions that he had with his father as like an adult, a young adult, and had a lot of questions for his father. He didn't really understand like why his father wasn't more resilient, or why he allowed for their family to even go to camp, like why they didn't just resist. And father and son had this dialogue, and I think that's actually kind of unusual. And it was really nice to see that because I think that more commonly, people didn't talk about the camp experience. Like there was a lot of shame. And George talks about how he was sort of disappointed in some ways in his father at the time, but now reflecting back, he realizes how his father really had this leadership role, and both of his parents really took these roles of resilience during World War II. He has this great line about how everything his mother did was her own statement of defiance, and he talks about that when she brought the sewing machine into camp as one of the few possessions that she brought with her. But it was a way to sort of make an abnormal situation as normal as possible, to try to make their surroundings, feel more comfortable. And so she, made those curtains and did whatever she could to try to protect her family, her children. George's father took on those roles of leadership. He was a block leader. He was, yeah, he was a representative, for the incarcerees um, at uh, at Roar and at Tule Lake, both of the camps they were in, and really did stand up for social justice at a time when, even though it seemed like they had choices to make, there really was no choice, and we see that later on in the story when George's mother, has to make those really difficult decisions about, renunciation of citizenship and different ways that she could protect her family. But yeah, I think that is really important, and George, sees that over his life as he reflects on his parents' experience.
Yeah. I really enjoyed that part where, his mom was tugging along her bag and she didn't want anybody to touch it. And then finally she opens it and it's the sewing machine and his dad just looked and fell out laughing and they just laughed. It was like a moment where they felt like relief. And again, that sign of resistance. Like I still get to own me, and I think that sometimes when communities and people are torn apart from their identities, that self-determination rises up. And it's still a sense of like, no, I get to define me on my own terms. And even something as simple as a sewing machine was, like you said, an act of resistance. I wanted to go in a little bit about, because in his book, he doesn't really go too deeply into the No-No Boys and what that movement meant. And I wanted to find out if you can share a little bit about what that experience was and that those group of folks, that resistance. I recall reading it and thinking of, and although he didn't go deeply in it, I thought immediately as an African American person of the Black Panther Party. And so I wanted to see, being resistant and strong-minded and standing steadfast in what it is that you believed in. And I wanted to see if you could share a little bit more about the No No Boys with us through your lens.